So hi, everybody, and welcome for all that have joined today for our community organizing panel, past and present. My name is Vera. As I said earlier, I am the chair of the Cambridge Women's Center's 50th anniversary celebrations. And I wanted to briefly open up with what the 50th celebrations are all about before we get to our fabulous moderator and panelists. So on March 6th in 1971, a group of women marched and took over a Harvard building with the purpose of finding a space where women could congregate and organize for a series of demands. And that includes access to medical care and birth control, economic equality, free community controlled childcare, and an end to the degradation of women in media. But there's of course still so much to fight for, an end to racial injustice, safe and affordable housing. That's just to name a few. So to commemorate the 10-day building takeover, we set up a series of virtual events this year to reflect some of the early events that women were fighting for, like a march that you can do safely on your own time, but also reflecting the offerings of the center and some needs of the community today. The events take place this week, and we still have some that people can attend. Also, if you do have the capacity, we are consider donating to our 50K goal of this year to keep our services vibrant for our community to come. So I'm going to share a screen of some of the events that are still ongoing. Let me see. Oh, sorry, just a second. So it started off on March 6th, but you can still sign up for some things. We do have a community or a women's history trivia that's tomorrow night. I do believe that's closed though for registration. However, we have 2 healing workshops that are happening on this upcoming Saturday. You can still sign up for those. As you can see on your screen, you have a radical self-love letters. It's a workshop specifically for BIPOC survivors of sexual violence, and it's BIPOC led. We also have a healing through trauma-informed yoga. And we have a final event from Foremothers Forward, which is kind of an event that's honoring actually Junie Norris, who is a leading foremother and CWC's current board president. You can register at that link at the bottom, bit.ly/CWC50. And now, allow me to introduce your moderator, Eva Martin-Blythe. Eva was a YWCA executive director for over 30 years, and that's just one of her titles. Eva has been an advocate for social justice and racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, women's rights, of course, and so much more. Welcome, Eva.
Thank you, Vera. And thank you, Cambridge Women's Center, for inviting me to moderate this very important panel this evening. I am honored to be part of this celebration. I'm honored to have worked for the YWCA, who partnered with the Cambridge Women's Center on so many issues past and present, and who shares your concerns, your work in the area of furthering the issues that are important to women. When I looked back at the history of the Cambridge Women's Center, and I realized that 3 of the most important demands that came out of the 50-year-ago activity were demands for affordable housing and childcare and education, I thought some things never change. Some things don't get any different. They don't change, they just get different. The times are different, the subsets are different, but the larger issues that concern women and those who are concerned with issues of concern to women, they don't change. Our work continues, the work of the Women's Center continues, and I'm just really pleased to be moderating a panel composed of made up of 4 women who are part of the significant history of the Cambridge Women's Center. Some of whom were involved 50 years ago, some of whom may not have been born 50 years ago, some of whom have been very much involved in the last number of years. But regardless of where, at what point one enters a relationship with the Cambridge Women's Center, you're never the same. Your desires, your mission, your personal mission, your philosophical mission can only be enhanced by our relationship with the Cambridge Women's Center. So with that, again, thank you for honoring me with the opportunity of moderating this panel. I'm going to introduce the 4 panelists to you, and let me tell you a little bit about, and they're going to introduce themselves, and as part of their introduction, they're going to answer some questions. So let me tell you what those questions are up front. So when you hear the answers from each of them, you can kind of tie back. We're going to ask each of the women, each of the panelists to tell us whose shoulders they stand on. And that will be something that we ask you as participants to share with us later on in the discussion portion of this issue, of this evening. We're going to ask each of the panelists to give us a little bit of information about what brings them to this point in their personal history. And then obviously, first and foremost, they're going to introduce us to themselves, and they're going to tell us a little bit about, if they choose to, who they are outside the credentials, that tagline that we all have, whether it's activist or executive director. I think we're all, regardless of what we are, we're activists, what our titles are, but anything else that they would choose to share. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of the rest of the evening as well, and then we'll start with our panel. So following the introduction of the self-introduction from each of the panelists and their answers to those questions and information they want to share about themselves, then we'll go into about an hour's worth of discussion. And each of them will share information about their connection to the Women's Center, about their work in organizing, and more. And then the mics, if you will be opened up, and there will be an opportunity to share. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. You won't all see the questions, but I will, and will try my best with the help of other Women's Center leaders this evening to make sure that your questions get answered. And then if we have time at the very end, we'll ask you to raise your hands and we'll acknowledge you, and we'll answer those questions as well to the extent the time permits. So without any further chit chat from me, I'm pleased to introduce, let me start with Cathy Hoffman. And I think what I'm going to do is start with the elders, if you will. And that's a statement of respect. And let me just make another statement that I wanted to make. Today is the day that's recognized as Harriet Tubman's birthday. We don't know when she was actually born, because she was a slave, obviously. But I think it's important that this day, this panel is being held on a day that's recognized as Harriet Tubman's Day because of her involvement, her commitment to leading people to freedom, leading people out of bondage. And in a large sense, that's the work that the Cambridge Women's Center has done over its 50 years. So keep that in mind as you participate in this evening. And without further ado, then Cathy, would you please start?
All right. Although, Caroline, I think you have a few years on me, but I guess we'll be the elders. So I'll kick it and then kick it to you. So I'm Cathy Hoffman. I'm lifelong, pretty much since 1957, resident of Cambridge. And that has given me the blessing of spanning a lot of movements over a lot of decades and being able to touch into a number of them, whether those are gay liberation, solidarity, anti-militarism, capitalism, neighborhood organizing, women, etc. Nonviolent civil disobedience, which is a lot of what I'm working with these days, climate. Whose shoulders I stand on. Been thinking about this, and so I wanted to say that I feel in this moment that I am standing on the shoulders of a number of young and younger women in my life. Marie Therese, Stephanie, Angela, Dara. I have been so lucky to have been touched by so many decades of activism. But these young women who are engaged in many different ways have really given me the opportunity to share some of that history and to redesign it to make it relevant to today. So without that intergenerational bond, a lot of what I have learned and some of the mistakes made would get reinvented. So I want to say that. And who am I outside of my credentials? So I wrote down a recovering human being, which my friend Ulrich Johnson always says. Unpacking the conditioning of white and human supremacy, trying to live an existence of less separation from others and the earth. I'm a grandmother. I'm someone who is really trying to nurture a daily practice of gratitude for the generosity of the earth and for the possibility of a different kind of, as Vincent Harding says, the America, and Hughes, the America yet to be. So I'll just say that. And I guess I pass it to my neighbor, Caroline. Is that right, Eva, or do you?
Yes, yes.
Yes, who is
This
your
is a
elder?
self-led group.
Elder and my neighbor.
Oh, elder and neighbor. Proud to be your elder and your neighbor both. I'm Caroline Hunter, and I'm standing on the shoulders of my mother, who lived to be 101 and a half, who did not have a high school education, but who read when I was younger, was reading the Christian Science Monitor, which was an international newspaper. So long before I was in the Christian Science Monitor, which I was reading it. Standing on her shoulders in the sense that I grew up, I am 74. So I was born in 1946 under segregated New Orleans. Segregation in New Orleans, legal segregation, which a lot of people here don't quite understand what that meant. My mother and father worked to give their 6 children everything they didn't have, which is a good Catholic education. And somehow that led me to a sense of right and wrong. And I had the pleasure of reading Cry to Beloved Country in 10th grade and didn't know what it meant to my life until I discovered an ID card made for South Africa at Polaroid. So my activism involves leading an international boycott against South Africa. It involves organizing a Winnie Mandela Solidarity Committee, a group of women. And that activity also has led me to organize activities in support of Palestine. And then I've done things in my neighborhood, including neighborhood issues both in the port and in Cambridge Port, where I live. I've lived in both of those neighborhoods in Cambridge. I'm a co-founder of the Benjamin Banneker Charter School, along with parents from Jefferson Park and the Agassiz School and the Washington Elms, and currently involved with My Brother's Keeper, doing education workshops for parents in Cambridge on Zoom. In terms of what brings me to history at this point, I was at the march. One of my first public speaking events was at the Women's March 50 years ago on this foot of the State House. And most recently, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Polaroid boycott. Outside of those credentials, I am a widow. My co-founder and co-founder of the Polaroid boycott, Ken Williams, is deceased, but his memory and his legacy lives on above and beyond his anti-activist work, his anti-apartheid work, because he was also a humanitarian and did 2 humanitarian concerts for Somalia and Eritrea. I'm also a mother and I'm a grandmother, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Cathy. And if we could now proceed to Natanja, Craig, I'll get it right, Oquendo. Would you share with us, Natanja?
Of course, thank you. And I know it's a mouthful. I blame my husband for that last name. It's Oquendo, but Natanja, Craig-Oquendo, thank you all. I feel honored to be here. It's so funny, I'm listening to Cathy and Carolyn, and I'm like, oh God, I feel like I'm not even on the panel. I'm just here amongst giants. So thank you for asking this question, Eva. I feel like I stand on the shoulders. Cathy talked about some of the younger generation. I'm often thinking about those who came before me, because I know that the road that has been paved has not been easy. I think about Septima Clark. I think about Sojourner Truth. I think about Stacey Abrams. I think more recently with my job at the Boston Women's Fund, I think about Renee Gray and her what seemed to be, I did not know her, but what seems to be her love of community, her love and her devotion to the grassroots community, and specifically to Black and Brown women. But I would be remiss if I didn't end with my mom. That is exactly whose shoulders I stand on. She was also a fierce advocate and organizer in Villa Victoria, where I grew up, and I had the honor to watch her do that, often frustrated because her attention was being split, helping others, but understanding now the importance of that work. So that is the shoulders that I stand on, and there are many that I'm sure I'm forgetting, but those were some of the women that came to mind for me today. And how did I get to this point? A lot of mistakes, I think. I got to this place because I have never been one who traveled alone. I've always thought that coalition building and kind of locking arms with others has been a really important part of my own journey. And I like to think of myself as a philanthropic organizer, which is very hard, by the way, because philanthropy does not like to necessarily organize ourselves. We'll talk about that later. Who I am outside of being an executive director at Boston Women's Fund, which gives me much pride. I am first a daughter, I am a mother, I am a grandmother to a very beautiful 7-year-old, Mila, who I think is magical. I am a friend, and I am a supporter of and an advocate for women and girls.
Thank you, Natanja. And last but certainly not least, Lynn Murray. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I'm enjoying this panel that I'm on, listening to everyone. So I came to Boston 25 years ago seeking the women's community. I had a lot of ideas and some rage, but not analysis or language to explain what I was feeling, and I found some great communities. I found the Sojourner of the Feminist newspaper in Jamaica Plain and worked there a little bit, and Teen Voices, a magazine for girls, worked there a little bit. The Black Women's Health Study at BU, just little pockets of communities of women, Boston Women's Fund, and then the Women's Center I found. And I would say I'm standing on the shoulders of many women, but the one woman I thought I would mention today is Mary Quinn, who was the executive director of the Women's Center when I met her, and really was so generous and helpful to me, long-time welfare rights organizer, and taught me a lot about community organizing. and helped me develop my own analysis and approach to organizing women. And so I'm so grateful. Even today, she's still a mentor and friend. So I stand on, she's someone I wanted to mention today. Who am I outside of my credentials? A sister, daughter, friend, mentor, karaoke singer, plant mom. Those are some of those are some categories I'm in. Really happy to be here.
Thank you, Lynn. A very diverse group, wouldn't you agree? Certainly all committed to women's issues, all committed to women's rights, all committed to fairness and equity and equality, but bringing to the table other interests and other involvements, which makes each one of us, and I include this whole audience, each one of us unique and varied people, unique and varied women who are products of our environment, who are products of the shoulders upon whom we stand, who are products of the work that we do and the commitments that we have to all of the things that I've already mentioned and all of the things that will be mentioned frequently this evening: fairness, equity, freedom, what have you. So without that, let's start with you, Lynn, at this end of the questioning. Would you share with us some information? Do you have one story about the Cambridge Women's Center that you'd like to share, and how that has impacted you in terms of your subsequent organizing work?
Yeah, I have a story. It's going to seem a little far-flung, but I'll make it connect. Recently, in my current role, I work for a nonprofit organization that helps young people express themselves creatively through technology. And there was a project I needed to get some advice about, an organizing project with youth. And I was referred to someone who turns out to be the daughter of, so I was referred to as someone to give me some advice about how to organize young people. The woman who I was referred to actually is the daughter of a woman I was organizing with at the Cambridge Women's Center. She was at the time 8 years old, in childcare at the Women's Center. Her mom was in another room with a bunch of other women, and we were strategizing about our next steps in our campaign. And, she was 8. And now I'm on a Zoom call with her in her 20s, and she's talking to me about strategy and best practices and things like that. And I find that to be so powerful and such an illustrative example of the power of organizing with women and the impact, like the deep generational impact when you organize with women, the ripple effect and how far that goes. And I think that's the story I would share about one memory.
Thank you. I think there's an adage that says the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree.
Right.
And I think that the example that you've given just now, Lynn, is a clear example of the influence, either directly or indirectly, either overtly or inadvertently, the influence that we have over our daughters, our younger siblings, even our sons sometimes. I'm one of those women who has sons who's tried to raise feminists as sons. Sometimes I think I've succeeded, and there are other days I wonder whose children they are. But nevertheless, moving right along. Caroline, would you like to share a story? Do you have a story that exemplifies your involvement with the Women's Center and how it's influenced your organizing work to date?
I think it's twofold. At one point in my career, I worked at Framingham Women's Prison. And so there was a clear connection between the Women's Center and services for families out of the prison, and reverse services for women who, once they were released from prison. And then my larger connection is through the film, organizing and supporting the film, Left on Pearl. I looked in my notes and I had something that went back as far as 2006 for an organizing meeting, most that were held at the Women's Center. It's more of the issue of solidarity. At one point in my anti-apartheid career, I organized the Winnie Mandela Solidarity Committee, hoping that, and we developed a pamphlet about the suffering of Black women in South Africa, Winnie Mandela herself, and South African women in general, Black women in South Africa in general, in hopes that that would influence the women's movement and then broaden the anti-apartheid movement. Because we felt that if we could broaden the interests of women and broaden the knowledge of our solidarity with women in South Africa and around the world, it would lead to change faster. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Tanya, you have a story?
So I am the newest member of, or a lover, I should say, of the Cambridge Women's Center. But so I'm 6 months on the job, and in my first couple of months, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with our grantees, and was struck by how much Boston Women's Fund and the Cambridge Women's Center has in common in terms of how they decide to engage with their partners, right? So I don't necessarily have a story, but I do see a lot of parallels. So when I think about, you know, I also haven't had the pleasure of coming to, so I still need an invite to actually get to the center, by the way, because we are moving to Cambridge in June, so we'll be neighbors, or at least closer together. But when I think about what has been described to me, not just by those on this panel, but others who have been part of the center, it sounds like it is a place of comfort, it's a place of support, it is a place where we are allowing women to have autonomy and to make decisions for themselves. And the Boston Women's Fund is about 7 years younger than the Cambridge Women's Center, but I have a feeling that we spent lots of time going back and forth between and working really closely together over those years. And I think I can say that the fund is only better because of that. And I think that we've learned a lot in terms of how to really listen to you set the example in terms of how to really listen and keep our ear to the ground and allow those who we ultimately are trying to serve to be the leaders. And so it's not a story, but it is definitely the connection I feel.
Lesson in reciprocity. Thank you. Cathy, we know you have lots of stories and lots of thoughts about how you got to this point in your organizing career.
Wow. Well, I want to go back to a project called the Women's School. And just in terms of continuity, I see Mrs. Lino and Sarah Boyer and Rochelle and Judy Norris and Peggy and Laura and Adrian. There are lots of people who are on this call who have been there. And especially Mary Lino came a little bit later, but I feel like she was there from the beginning. The Women's School was a project that came out of the Women's Center, and I joined it in 1975 and was part of it for the next 10 or 15 years. And some of the features of it, for those who don't know, it was organized and run by a volunteer collective of women. And so that meant we sat in circle with each other and argued and had to figure out how things could evolve around consensus. And we offered classes, I mean, 8-week classes for women on anything from Marxism to politics of lesbianism to women's health to self-defense, all kinds of women's history, which is what I taught. And partly this was a kind of entry invitation for mostly younger women, mostly white women, but who were activists or wanted to meet other people. And so they could take a class at the women's school. And like many other things at the time, there was no women's studies. There was no women's health. There were not battered women's formal shelters. I mean, all of that work was things that we just did for ourselves. So we created, Peggy, you know, the Women's Health Center, where women went and got to learn about our bodies, and people formed informally. The transition house became a battered women's shelter, but it was in women's homes. And those things, so many of what we did out of a sense of sisterhood and emergent radicalism have become professionalized and institutionalized. And there are some victories one can, I suppose, look to from that. But like forms of integration, some of that institutionalization also took away a lot of the spirit of those who had created it, in terms of kind of self-determination, got really reshaped. But how does it connect through work around El Salvador and Bethlehem, Cambridge, People to People, and a lot of anti-militarism work in Cambridge? Part of it is, I feel like we had certain messages. We sat in circle in a way that lots of other people have done in many other cultural contexts. But I feel like I have returned to sitting in circle and that sense of everybody's voice counting, and a different kind of model of leadership. The women's movement spawned this notion of consciousness raising, which, you know, has roots in other movements as well, but lives on today around this sense of our personal lives, our personal identities are relevant to political organizing. And the notion of intersectionality, that for me, women's movement was sort of connected to issues about really transformation of society, and issues about racial justice, and issues about class and anti-capitalism. And so the women's school was a sort of hotbed for all of that. Plus it was joyful. And I feel like we've returned to joyful, healing justice work. A lot of it now led by women of color, led by Indigenous women, but hopefully for those of us sort of understanding that the kind of world we want to build, we have to live that world, not just be sort of direct action anti-activists, but we got to be really pro a different kind of world that works for everybody. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's why we're all here this evening, to share our stories and to listen to each other and to learn more about how we create the world that we want to live in, how we work toward organizing, how we organize actually to produce a world that we want to live in, that's fair. And I will say this numerous times because it's kind of my own personal mantra: fair and equitable and even-handed in terms of dealing with people, particularly women of color, throughout society. And Cathy, I'm glad that you mentioned the work of Indigenous women, because I think that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the whole concept of circle is a characteristic of Indigenous leadership. And sometimes we think we've claimed it when we've claimed it, but we didn't originate it. And I think that's important to mention. I think that it's important to recognize that the concept of circle grew out of many of the cultures, many of the countries from which women were brought to this country, not at all by their own choosing, but they brought with them the things that they knew in their cultures and applied them in ways that were workable, not necessarily to the powers that be, but that were workable and usable and that helped in the sustainability, if you will, and the survivability of those cultures. So moving on then to a question that I'm going to throw out to all four of you, and I'm not going to say so-and-so or whomever, but share with us some thoughts about what you think about your work in organizing, and again, thinking about where you've been in terms of your evolution as an organizer, and how you use that learning now, and how, if at all, organizing has changed in the last 50 years or in your lifetimes of organizing. So don't all run to the turn off your mute buttons at the same time.
Since you said 50 years, I can certainly start there.
Thank you.
Because it certainly has changed significantly. Our grassroots campaign that grew into an international boycott was non-digital. There was no such thing as a cell phone 50 years ago for you young people. There were not personal computers. Our leaflets were produced on a mimeograph machine. And when we couldn't mimeograph it, they were typed on a typewriter, produced on a mimeograph machine. And when we wanted to get more sophisticated, we laid it out with letters and whatever, and got it printed, offset printing. Okay. So it definitely was personal. Leafleting was a big deal. That's the way you got your information out. You stood at the subway at Harvard Square, on Mass Avenue by the Turnpike. You got things to students leaving town, and snail mail. I am in the process of attempting to gather my resources and papers and putting together a book. And I opened up some old mail, and I had $1 from someone who wrote me looking for literature, because people would write us to get literature, which maybe we sold for $1, or maybe they donated $1, which was significant at the time. So things have changed rapidly in terms of book research and that sort of thing. Newspapers were big back then. There were 3 national stations, so a lot more should be able to be accomplished with the digital age, but it is still an issue of person-to-person contact. I think if you want to look at the ultimate model for organizing, you have to look to Georgia and the campaign for new voters. And that the success of that campaign, that it was long, it was diligent, and it met people where they were with minimum of 5 touches. And certainly the 50 years ago, we had lots of gatherings, but they were rallies back then. Rallies, picketing, protest, physical protest, but certainly the contact point was still person to person and talking to people. And I'll stop there.
You're muted, Eva.
Okay, my apologies. I have a little technical difficulty here. Who would like to go next? Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much for those words. Lynn, I see you have your mic off.
I was just thinking about thinking when I first started doing community organizing work that the organizer needed to be a certain type of person. I wasn't even certain that I could be an organizer. I was like, I'm not loud on the megaphone, kick the door in. Those are my ideas about the role. And then later realizing, no, this movement is large and there's room for lots of different people to do the work, whether you're an artist or an educator or young and old or whatever. there's room, there's enough work to do, and a need to pull all the skill sets in. And I think that approach is what I use to sort of engage with people, to say, we need, we need you if you want to be here. And I feel like that's just been a way that I have done the work. And I feel like it's, for me, it brought me in and it showed me that I could do organizing work, and that also bring people along with me.
Excellent. Thank you. Cathy or Natanja?
Yeah, so first of all, I feel like I'm still an organizer in training. As I mentioned, I grew up in Villa Victoria, so there's something in my blood that is just about that life. I think everything I've approached has been around bringing people together, but as I mentioned earlier, I stumbled into my career in the philanthropic field and very quickly realized that people like me were not at the table when decisions were being made on my neighborhood. And so my organizing, at least within philanthropy, really started with the leaders that were doing the work. It was incredibly important to me that I figured out a way to make our own table. It wasn't even about pulling them up to the table that was already there. It was about creating the space so that their voices could be heard, and that their ideas and their innovation and their solutions to what they saw with the issues in their neighborhood were brought up to the foundation. But I'm with Lynn. I think I was also someone who, often some people will say Natanja's an organizer, get in touch with her, she knows everybody. I think there's a difference in having a big network and being an organizer, right? Even in this role, I continue to think about the role of philanthropy and how we are often pushing organizations to do the work that we are not yet ready to do. And so whether it is around equity, whether it is around liberation, whether it is around reparations, it seems that we are very quick to give direction, but not necessarily take it. And so I like to think of myself as a disruptor and an organizer in training.
Excellent. You made me think about the Shirley Chisholm quote that said, if there's not a seat at the table, bring your own damn chair. How many times have you brought your own chair?
More than I can count.
Absolutely. Cathy?
Well, I'm just noticing the sense of how important it is for us to redefine what is defined for us, like our own language, your sense about disruptors. And I know I went to, as part of a group, was invited to go to Standing Rock a few years ago. And it's really interesting at Standing Rock around Native sovereignty, that people there are not protesters. People are protectors, and they're clear, they're water protectors. And some of it is, again, just a consciousness about living in relation to part of the ecosystem, not dominating it or controlling it. And there's a way in which some of our political organizing has modeled itself in that dominant patriarchal kind of white way of top-down leadership and hierarchy. And so I think some of the women's movement and other movements have really looked at that differently. So disruptor, protector, transformer, not just protester. So I'm thinking about that, and also coming of age as Caroline did with the Mimeo machine. It's like some of us, we can remember the smell of those Mimeo machines and them breaking it down. It was like in our hand, it's like it was a mess, but it's really been a powerful challenge the ways in which digital social media organizing enables people to reach many, many more people, but not necessarily relate with them. So how we build in community and connection is, I think, really a challenge. And I was part of a movement, the Pledge of Resistance against US anti-intervention in Central America, as well as the Gay and Lesbian Defense Committee. I have my little foster equality pin on me in 1985, 86, both of them. That was when Governor Dukakis said that gay people couldn't be foster parents or adoptive parents. And we kind of took to the streets, some adoptive queer women with bags over their heads. But with both of those, we formed affinity groups because part of what we did was participated in civil disobedience. We risked arrest, and in order to do that, we said to people, you have to go through a training, and if you're in a training, then you have to get yourself into an organized group, because for each person who's going to risk arrest, you need to have 2 people in your affinity group who are supporting you, making that possible. And so we had hundreds of affinity groups, and we could mobilize people. Like Caroline was saying, we had phone trees. And with the Pledge of Resistance, we could mobilize 3,000 people overnight. And they were in communities. So when they showed up for risking arrest, 542 people at the federal building one May in 1985, people were already organized, already connected, and it was a sustainable model. So I think about that and my own challenge of trying to kind of keep suggesting those notions about affinity groups into the present moment. And I think the other person that's come to mind, I mean, for me, we've had a lot of movement issues around democracy and what that looks like, and elections. And for me, the shoulders for me are the freedom movement. That really, it has been African-American people in this country who have been the people who actually believed in and tried to bring about democracy, which is a sort of astonishing thing. But the example of Rosa Parks, who comes to us as this single person who sat down because she was tired, but had been part of the Highlander Center, had been part of 6 weeks organizing in nonviolence, was head of the NAACP. And when she sat down, which sparked a moment, Black women in the community led that bus boycott for 375 days. And so I think sometimes our ideas about how and who organizes and who are the leaders they're given to us like these people on the mountaintop, but in fact, it comes out of communities that people stand on and stand with. And we need to figure out how to make some of those things happen in this moment. So thinking.
All of your points are well taken. All of your points are excellent in terms of thinking about the whole concept of organizing. You know, I'm thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, who came to the table with, you know, what the mountaintop people would say were no credentials, but who came to the table with years and years and years of experience in terms of working in a sharecropping environment and supporting each other and helping each other to survive, and how she took those skills and that stamina to the Democratic Party and said, no, you need to stop this stuff because it's not good. It's not working. It's not representative of all the people. Certainly not Black people, and certainly not Black women.
That's right.
With that thought in mind, go ahead.
I just wanted to add something because I appreciate the story about Rosa Parks, and thank you, Cathy, for bringing it up, and Caroline for reminding us Because I do think that that it is easier to get to people, but you're right. I think that human connection is missing, right? The knocking on the door, the having the conversation, the explaining what the issues are, and how our liberation is tied together, right? So if I am not free, you will never be free.
Absolutely.
So I'm really appreciative of both of you. But when I was a teen mom, I got pregnant at 14. I had my first daughter at 15. She is glamorous and doing great things with herself. And I can't help but think about Claudette Cloven, who actually was the first person to sit on the bus. And the reason why Claudette's story is not known is because she was 16, and they didn't think that she was the right representation. And so, to Lynn's point earlier, I just want to say that there is a place for everybody in this movement. Until we are free, there is a place for our young people, those who have made mistakes. And not that I think that my daughter was a mistake, but those that have taken a different road. And I think that's important for us to remember as leaders in this space, and also just as humans, is to see the humanity in each other.
And that's Claudette Cloven was arrested March 1st. And then it was December 1st that Rosa Parks was arrested. And Rosa Parks said, if it had not been for Claudette Cloven, she would not have done what she would not have carried that on. And so internal to movements, people know some of this, but the sense of how that gets left out and left out and left out, and the importance of bringing those stories and those lives in is so important.
Amen.
It really is, because it's representation. I mean, if those stories being told, then you get to see yourself in the story.
That's right.
And that's really important.
I think that's also true of the anti-apartheid movement, that the success of that movement was really the fact that numerous organizations around the country first, around the United States first, Black community organizations, that this was a movement led by Black people, by young Black people, by students, and numerous organizations around the country and the world took up the same cause. What we call intersectionality was the original coalition politics of Black community organizations, civic organizations, church organizations, labor unions, longshoremen in New Bedford, New Orleans, Black longshoremen, New Bedford, New Orleans, and California refusing to load granny apples. Every segment of the community putting their might where they had it in this boycott. So those are the untold stories around organizing, that no movement stands on the shoulders of one particular person or one particular individual, but it's those many, many pieces that make this fabric that we hope will be changing. We look at the Black Lives Matter movement now, that it is a diverse movement, but it started with young Black women in Ferguson.
That's right.
And it's now an international movement with no, what is the credential? The credential is you see something, you say something.
Amen.
You do something.
Sure, I'm just struck by the continuity of but the diversity of the examples that each of you brought. It's important for us to remember our history. We can't know where we're going if we don't know where we've been. And I think all too frequently, looking at the legitimate complaints about what isn't taught in the schools, and particularly now when there's quasi-school anyway, it's disheartening to think about all of the things that our children don't know. They don't know about our history. They don't know about how the world got to be where it is. They don't know about the contributions of known, not just unknown, but frequently known names in our history. And we have I think organizations, places like the Women's Center, assume a responsibility, assume a significant place in our society in terms of making sure that those messages get carried forward. Just an observation, I was struck with the with the number of carriages and toddlers and strollers that were at the first Women's March. There were as many little people, little young women probably, in some kind of piece of equipment that had to be pushed or pulled or somehow brought to bear. And hopefully those children were either by osmosis, or by teaching of their parents, or by listening, or some other vehicle, learning about the history of the women's movement, learning about the women who have gone before, who have paved the way for us, who have basically plowed the road to give us the opportunities that we have and don't always take advantage of. And I think that, you know, that's another place where the Cambridge Women's Center plays an important role still in our society, is that they have not lost, the Cambridge Women's Center has not lost sight of the importance of sharing stories and moving messages from one generation to the next, and instilling that kind of important learning in our young people. We're coming close to the end of this segment of questions, but I've got a couple of other questions I want to ask before we go to the chat and to the questions from our participating audience. You know, you've talked about how you yourselves and others have organized. And certainly one of the words that fits this whole discussion is creativity. Another word I think that fits this discussion very, very well is the concept of community, the concept of circle, the concept of oneness. Are there comments that you'd like to add, panelists, about any of those philosophies, those operating philosophies, those thoughts, those ideas as it relates to organizing now? And then let me segue into the next question, and that is, can we talk just a little bit about who are the women who come to the Cambridge Women's Center now and why they come? So, open mic.
I'll say one thing. Again, it's about language, that the notion of rights versus the notion of liberation. You know, the civil rights movement was a freedom movement. Gay liberation began as gay liberation movement. Women's liberation was about women's liberation. And we got channeled into gay rights, women's rights, which really kind of made us ultimately more marketable and more consumer oriented, and as opposed to agents of our own beauty and brilliance. I have this little foster equality button around the gay adoption issue. With Dukakis, we had to both struggle against the issue that gay people shouldn't be in relation to children, right? Queer people shouldn't be around children. This was like taboo. And people arguing for gay civil rights at State House, which we didn't have then, of course, don't have in many states today, were like, please don't talk about children. Please don't be so bold. We're trying to trying to fit in like everybody else. And we were like, no, because in addition to the external homophobia was our own internalized homophobia, our own sense that there was something wrong with ourselves, that we had been brought up in families that taught us that. And so our foster equality movement was bold and joyous, and very going to places publicly, bowling alleys, all kinds of things, and 50s bars, and then handing out little cards saying, thank you for spending the evening with gay men and lesbians. And because if we didn't hold up our own joyful selves, then we were really, able to be co-opted in profound ways. And so, I mean, to me, the essence of Black Lives Matter and movements today is about front and center the brilliance, beauty, contribution out of communities. And then from there, people can take up specific issues and specific platforms and things like that. But it has to be built on that sense of liberatoriness and liberation. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah, Cathy, I'd like to lead to language again, because I think that's the issue where before Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, where now it's a slogan, and now people are talking about it's more than a slogan, that there's certain things you have to do to demonstrate you believe this to be so. And we know it with the daily murder and slaughter of Black people, that it is just a slogan, but that the language is critical. The language for defund the police is thoughtful and critical. It's shocking to people, but if you look at the police department in Rochester versus the police department in Cambridge, yeah, you want to defund the police. So yes, the language in terms of how we move forward in terms of liberation and justice is critical.
Thank you, Caroline. Tanya or Lynn, would you like to add something?
I keep forgetting. I listen to Cathy and Caroline. I keep forgetting I'm on the panel. I couldn't agree more. First of all, I don't want to be on the panel. I just want to listen. But I'm happy to be here. I mean that in the best type of way. I just couldn't agree more. I just think that, as a Black woman, we're often told how resilient we are, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the resilience I see in my other sisters. But I am not interested in our resilience. I'm interested in our liberation and our freedom, because we have been fighting for quite a long time. And I appreciate the trends, and I will call it that until I see real change. I appreciate the trends that have been happening, right? That people, corporations, that we are thinking differently about the police, that corporations are thinking differently about, equity and inclusion in a real way, right? But for me, we have to start putting our money where our mouth is. And that means that we have to start centering the voices of women and girls. And I mean that with a big, big W. So non-gender conforming, non-binary, our trans sisters, because until our most vulnerable person is safe, and to me, that is Black trans women right now, then none of us are safe. And so I think this linkage that continues to be what brings us to organize, right? It is not, organizing can be fun, but by no means is it easy, right? You are trying to bring along, and Caroline and Cathy and Lynn can probably talk about this in more than I can, but you are trying to bring along people to stay the long haul, right? Like apartheid didn't end after a year. I think that's the problem, is that with technology, is that we want things to happen so quickly, but we have the wherewithal that we need to remind each other, and we need to remind each other to rest, to find the joy, right? Like those are also parts of organizing, because that allows us to keep the steam within us so that we can keep going. So that's what I would add.
Quite well taken. And I think one of the things that just occurred to me as you were talking was, finding the joy. And in my experience, some of the joy has been the friends that I made 30, 40 years ago are still in my circle of friends. I may not see them regularly, I may not talk to them regularly, but those memes that say things like, I haven't talked to you for 40 years, but I'll call you and we can pick up where we left off. Those are real. And many of those relationships developed out of organizing, developed out of various movements, developed out of our respective personal commitments to things that we believed in, things that we still believe in many times. You know, things that we're still willing to fight for, to march for, to get out the vote for, and all of the other things that we have to do to influence the population. Before we go to questions from our participants who've been pleasantly silent, but I know have questions to ask and things that they want to know, is there anything else that you as the panelists want to add? Okay, going. So, Kim, can we have questions brought forward that, and if they need to be posed to individual panelists, let me know that, and we'll try to deal with this effectively and efficiently over the next 20 minutes or so.
Sure, I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I think maybe if we give people a minute or two to add questions.
If you have questions, please, and given the fact that we don't have questions in the chat right now, if you have questions you'd like to ask, raise your hands, and we'll deal with your questions that way, or comments. These panelists have been so informative and instructive and helpful that we're all full of information to walk away with and start organizing anew.
Carolyn, I'm really interested in other people on the panel talking about intergenerationality, because it has really been so powerful for me to see these organizations of young people calling on you, Caroline, to come and share your story.
Yes.
To sort of mentor. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what mentorship looks like, so that we're not abandoning the next generations.
Absolutely not. My first speaking at a Black Lives Matter protest in Cambridge was the one organized by MBK. And I was one of the elders invited, and I am quite honored to be remembered and thought of fondly. And I think a lot of it has to do with my career in Cambridge, where the other thing I didn't talk about is my education career. When I worked at Polaroid, I got fired. My background is I'm a bench chemist, research chemist, and a math minor, chemistry major, math minor. But while I was at Polaroid, I had started teaching adults. And so I was excited about being a teacher, and eventually got a couple of master's degrees. But I retired from 34 years in Cambridge Public Schools. So I have a connection to young people that has to do more with that role as an educator in the community. And so I do know a lot about teaching from the personal standpoint of being a classroom teacher, but I also was an administrator and an assistant principal. So it's my pleasure now to come back to be on forums with my brother's keeper, both as a parent, because I was an active teacher and an active parent when I was in the Cambridge Public Schools, to be able to say to parents, to talk to them about the amount of power that they have to be able to will. So it's been my honor now to speak to both, on all sides of the equation, to young people, and to say to them that learning is a verb, it's an action word. And I joke with Tony Clark, because he's an English teacher, and I say, y'all call it a gerund, but it's an action word. But to be able to challenge young people to take the best of all of their abilities for the good of others, and to talk to parents about their ability to empower themselves and their children and demand justice from school systems, and to educators who want to better the school system. So I've done all of those roles in the course of my life, and happy to share whatever information I have now.
sorry, we have a question in the chat. In what way, what role do you see the Cambridge Women's Center supporting, leading community activism into the future? Who'd like to answer that? The role of the Cambridge Women's Center leading, supporting community activism into the future?
I mean, I think one answer, and there's probably many answers, is it continuing to be what it's always been, is a convener, a safe place for people, for women to come together and have like rigorous dialogue about what's meaningful and do some of that unlearning together that gets internalized and prevents us from those visions of liberation. I think it's been that, and I know it was that for me, and I think if it can continue to be that, I think that will support activism going forward in the future.
Excellent. Any other thoughts?
I would just add that I think place is really important, like actually having a drop-in center where people can gather, because I think we do take so much of our time, especially during this pandemic, obviously being online, but I think that place is incredibly important. I would also say that I think that we have to continue to challenge ourselves as organizations to think about what our equity and our inclusion is looking like. And I know the question that I'm constantly asking myself is, who is not at the table? Who are we talking about that is not around to give us advice, right? And how do we ensure that we're opening ourselves enough so that we're making room for others, right? So that we're walking the walk. So I would say continue to challenge yourself internally when it comes to your own equity and inclusion lens. And then just remember how important space is.
And it's hard. It's very hard in this time of pandemic when, there are a bunch of us here, but we can't reach out and I'm a kind of a touchy-feely person. And if I'm sitting next to you, I'm going to touch you as I talk to you. And I can't touch you, and it's just really frustrating. I can't see the nuances of the expressions on your faces as we have conversations. And I think that's a significant piece of what's missing in our conversations and in our learning right now. Next question, before I go off on a tangent. Comment that evolves into a question. I'm curious about several things. Would love to hear how decision-making at CWC evolved. So many women's groups used consensus, which was joyful and difficult. Would love some on-the-ground stories. Also interested if there were women involved in CWC who are also involved with Seneca Women's Peace Camp, and if and how the two intersected. I probably have other, but we'll start with these. Thank you. There are about 20 questions here. I don't know who wants to take this on, certainly. Please feel free to do so. First, there's the piece about consensus, about decision-making. If any women at CWCA were involved in the Seneca Women's Peace Camp, and then and how the two intersected. Those are some of the salient questions in these, salient sub-questions in this larger question. Comments, response?
Virginia Hearn, I think you were at the Seneca Women's Peace Encampment.
Yes, I was in the, probably from starting in 1985. I don't know if I never lived there, but went up regularly. And you were also?
I mean, I went and was arrested there going over the fence for a number of the things. And I don't know who else. Laura Holmes is on this. I think Laura might have been there also. I don't think, and I feel like the women's center, current women's center people should feel free to answer some of these things too. But I experience the women's center as being not so much involved in global political organizing. So maybe someone will correct me. So the people that I went to Seneca with came out of people who've been involved with Women's Pentagon Action and came out of anti-militarist work, and not so much out of the Women's Center. So that's my Women's Seneca encampment kind of took off after Greenham Common in England, where they were building the cruise missiles, and women started out men and women, but then it got taken over by women who encircled the base and created an encampment there over 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, and occasionally going onto the base, being arrested, but to try and stop the creation of cruise missiles and the US involvement in that project. And so then people went and created a similar encampment and lived in Seneca in upstate New York for a number of years. But I think some of that work around peace organizing, anti-militarist solidarity work, I don't connect so much with the Women's Center. For me, that was other parts of my life. I don't know what.
Thank you, Cathy, for making that distinction. We're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to turn this function this evening, this discussion, back to Vera, who's going to give you some information about how you can continue this dialogue, how you can continue to support the Women's Center and be involved in organizing in your own work, in your own lives, but with the Women's Center as well. So the last question: organizing in political activity often involves a long-time commitment. What sustains you and has sustained you to enable your activism? Comments, question, or comments? Answers?
I'm happy to start. I learned a really valuable lesson from my son, who was 17, but sadly lost his life to cancer. And that lesson was, my brain started to get mushy as I was making decisions about his care, right? Because I wasn't sleeping and I was trying to take care of my daughters at the same time as trying to take care of him. And what I realized, and I think what God's intervention really helped me see, is that if my cup is empty, I am not really giving to anybody. And so I think that I know there's a lot of talk about self-care. And I remember years back when I was a single mom, people asking me, well, how do you make time for yourself? And the truth is that self-care is a privilege. I didn't make time for myself because that wasn't part of what my life was, right? But I do think finding those moments, whether it is in prayer, which often is what it was for me, whether it is in community with your friends, right, that you can talk to and share the pain and the joy, right, that comes with organizing, and whether it's in breaks, right, like I believe in sleep, I believe in shutting things down, I believe in not always being on your computer. I think these are all important things in order to that this work is long term. And so I think if we treat it like a marathon, you will find yourself pacing differently. But if you treat it like a race, you're going to burn out. And so I would say pace yourself. Remember that it's a marathon, and shut it down when it needs to get shut down. Because others will lift up. They'll carry the torch.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Any other comments? I think I have.
Yeah, I would resonate with Natanja with that sense of community. I know one of outside the community of people with whom you struggle and produce with. My community of polar bears and my summer routine has been one of the things that has sustained me in terms of sharing joy and replenishing myself. And then also, I think it's true, it's the long haul, because it is whack-a-mole in terms of the fight for justice, the fight for rights and liberation. And you have to be able to be present to engage others. The other thing I would say about organizing is it really is about education, about sharing the cause and figuring out how it connects with other people and where the resonance is. Thank you.
Thank you. Vera, I'm going to infringe upon your time just a little bit more. This is not a question. Well, no, let me back up. The CWCA nurtured many organizations that eventually became independent. This seems very important. What allowed the CWCA to be such a place of creation? That seems like a long answer. There needs to be a long answer to a short question. When you think about the evolution of places like Transition House and Boston Women's Rape Crisis Center and other places that have evolved from been birthed by CWC, there's not a short and simple answer. But I will digress to members of the panel if there is one that can be brought to the table in a few minutes. So hold that thought, questioner.
I think one of the things that's really been important is the opportunity for groups that were spawned out of the Women's Center to keep reinventing themselves. I know that Transition House, for instance, you know, which came out of or supported by the Women's Center, became very kind of professionalized, and all of a sudden you needed degrees, and then people took a look and said, wait a second, what are our roots? Wait, we came out of a perspective around women's dignity and around the dignity of all people. And we came out of a radical sense of critiquing capitalism and critiquing patriarchy and seeing all ways in which abuse happened. How do we reclaim that? And so I feel like they took themselves back to a kind of radical reimagination of the work. And so I think some of it is just inviting people not to kind of take that linear place, but to look around at the models around us that are really about, as Caroline said, healing, justice, and profound transformation, not just individual rights that we gain, but in fact, transformation for society in which it's a really different picture than what we live in now. And so I think the Women's Center fostered that, but we have to keep fostering it.
Thank you. I'm going to apologize now to everyone else who has submitted a question or a comment simply because we're running out of time. We could go on probably for another hour or two in this conversation, but we simply have to end. I am going to close with a comment because I think it's very appropriate and very telling about the four women who have shared with us their stories, their experiences, their thoughts this evening. Not a question. This panel has been simply incredible. I am filled with deep joy from hearing each of your stories and perspectives. My cup is full to continue the work and inspired to find ways to be in authentic relationship and community with others. And on that note, thank you very much for the opportunity to chair this panel, to moderate this panel. I've learned more, I've gotten more than I have given, I assure you. And I thank you, everyone who's been part of this evening. And now, Vera, if you would share with us the logistics of what we need to know about continuing to support the center. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Eva, Caroline, Cathy, Natanja, Lynn. Thank you. This was so wonderful, and I echo what Ellie said there, that it was just an incredible panel and kind of filled with joy about what to do next from some of this information. So I just wanted to share basically how to, you know, something that I said at the beginning, but I think some people trickled in a bit later. So essentially, if you do want to still see something that's going on as part of our 50th anniversary celebrations, you can just go to the bit.ly/CWC -50 website and sign up there. Let me actually share a different screen as well, where you can also donate. Right there, you can also donate through that text portion as well, because we are raising 50K for our 50 years, hopefully to go strong for the next 50. But also, if you'd like to just get in touch with us about some of the groups that were mentioned, how, you know, historically some other organizations were spawned from some groups. So we do have groups and workshops now. That's part of what we do. So you can always email us at info@cambridgewomencenter.org to learn more, or go at cambridgewomencenter.org and learn about what we actually do day to day. I mean, it's our 50th anniversary, but just come to the center, you know, physically when you can, and you can actually show up physically these days, but only stay outside. And that's it. Yep. For everybody that joined us, thank you so much. And I think this was just absolutely wonderful. This was recorded, so we will also be sharing it.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you,
have a
Eva.
good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Music.
Happy anniversary.
Karaoke.
Yes.
Oh,
Lynn.
no.
I want to know your karaoke song, because mine's is Salt and Pepper.
Oh, that's a
I
good
can't really
one.
sing. Yeah, so I have to rap.
My go-to is I Want to Dance with Somebody.
Go on, Lynn. Okay.
Yeah. Oh my God. I
Have
wish
a
I
great
could
night.
sing that.
Okay, bye everyone.
Sounds like the
Bye.
next fundraiser, y'all. Karaoke fundraiser.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.